Thank you, Chairman Wyden. And while Ranking Member Crapo was unable to attend due to a prior commitment, it's a pleasure to briefly fill in on his behalf. And I look forward to continue working with all of my colleagues on this committee, especially in regard to responsible stewardship of taxpayer dollars. Today we're going to discuss the IRS's supplemental funding provided in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. The Chairman has a particular interest in the House-passed Limit, Save, and Grow Act and how it could impact IRS enforcement activities. Since the Finance Committee has yet to hold a hearing dedicated specifically to the $80 billion allocation, I find it curious that some prefer to focus on a House bill related to this funding rather than the effectiveness or oversight of the funding itself. Nevertheless, here we are. Last August, with the narrowest of majorities, Democrats gave the IRS approximately $80 billion, a sum equal to 6 times the agency's 2022 budget. Of the $80 billion provided to the IRS, more than half, about $46 billion, is directed toward enforcement activities, which includes increasing audits and hiring more enforcement agents. But only 4% of the $80 billion, 4%, was earmarked for improving taxpayer services. That is an overwhelmingly disproportionate amount directed to increased enforcement compared to taxpayer services. The National Taxpayer Advocate herself criticized the lopsided funding for enforcement. Since the IRA's enactment, Democrats have doubled down and made calls to further supersize the IRS enforcement arm. The President's budget seeks an additional $29 billion on top of the $80 billion in supplemental funding to the IRS for enforcement, again, in addition to the $46 billion for enforcement the IRS received only months ago. For context, the IRS's supplemental enforcement funding amount alone eclipses appropriations for Customs and Border Patrol, which received approximately $18 billion in total this year. Based on funding priorities, it seems that Democrats intend to create a bigger and more intrusive enforcement-focused agency without annual accountability to taxpayers in Congress. While Republicans are open to discussions about IRS resources, efficiency, accountability, and improvements to taxpayer services should be prioritized, all of which are lacking in the Inflation Reduction Act. Some on the other side of the aisle will say that the IRS needed $80 billion to address the tax gap, refill the agency's coffers, and tune up the agency's customer service. But that's hardly the case. First, the tax gap. The difference between taxes owed and paid has been steady for decades, and this committee should pursue bipartisan measures to narrow it. But any such effort must strike the appropriate balance between taxpayer responsibilities and taxpayer rights. Simply flooding the IRS with $80 billion in unchecked resources will not magically yield $700 billion in additional tax revenue, a fanciful estimate that President Biden made 2 years ago. Policymakers need to be honest about what is doable with respect to the tax gap and instead focus on encouraging voluntary compliance, as the current and former national taxpayer advocates argue. It should also be noted that tax compliance levels in the U.S. remain substantially unchanged since at least the 1980s. According to recent IRS data, about 84% of taxes were paid voluntarily and on time. After enforcement efforts and late payments were taken into account, about 86% of taxes were paid. As the former taxpayer advocate Nina Olson has said, most Americans pay their taxes voluntarily, and data show that increased enforcement adds a small fraction to what the government collects. Second, IRS budgets have been generally stable for at least the past 2 decades. Aside from the agency's all-time high budget of 2010, which spiked under all Democrat rule, the IRS's funding has remained broadly in line with historic norms. The argument that Republicans have somehow starved the agency simply does not hold. And to the extent that IRS budgets have been out of the norm, there is a lot of direct correlation with a decline in employee headcount, as some of my Democrat colleagues claim. The IRS's employee headcount has been declining for several decades regardless of the growth or contraction of the IRS's budget across dozens of Congresses and multiple presidential administrations. Third, the IRS's recent funding windfall lacks any binding reports or oversight measures. As Ranking Member Crapo recently put it, and I quote, "The IRS has embarked on a spend first, plan later approach that is not transparent or responsible and is a surefire recipe, I should say, for error, waste, and mismanagement," end quote. And I have to say I couldn't agree more. The IRS's Inflation Reduction Act Strategic Operating Plan, which was recently released more than 45 days late, was big on platitudes but short on details. But I was interested and disturbed to learn from the plan that the IRS intends to spend $3.8 billion of the allocated $80 billion on, quote, energy security. Energy security, by the way, in this context means implementing the IRA's climate tax agenda. By almost any reasonable measure, the non-binding plan is instructive in how ineffectual a plan is without timely updates, clear data on costs, and meaningful oversight from Congress. To address this gap and to better track taxpayer services, I introduced the IRS Funding Accountability Act with Senator Grassley and the Improve Reliable Services Now Act with Senator Collins. Pumping the brakes on new enforcement activities from the $80 billion funding allocation until basic accountability measures are met does not account to protecting wealthy tax cheats, as some have suggested. It's about the responsible stewardship of taxpayer dollars. We have an excellent panel before us today. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.